In this lesson, we're going to begin the process of assigning the subsurface materials to the squid's body. Alright, so here's where we left off in our previous lesson. So as you can see, we have a few very basic materials set up. And as you can see, we've also got still very, very rough effects on things like the light, as far as the overall light softness is concerned, as well as the anti-aliasing of the scenes and things like the displacement, which we don't have applied yet. All of these things are really just going to start to slow down the renders once we start to increase the quality. So right now we really kind of are sacrificing quality in order to gain some rendering speed, which is really what we want at this early stage. So before we start to even worry about things like the displacement on things like the squid body, let's first start to get the shader in place, and we can start to then worry about the displacement after the fact. Alright, so let's start by actually dropping in our subsurface shader, and in this case we'll use something like the Fast Simple. There we go. And if you're using a newer version of Maya, you should already have the light maps and things like that that are automatically going to be connected for you. So let's now take this shader that we have here, and we'll just middle click and drop it onto this squid's body. So let's see what this does for us. If it starts to become a little bit difficult to frame your objects in the scene, we can always go to the camera settings and enable the resolution gate, so that way we can actually see what the renderable area of our camera is. It makes it now much easier to come in and start to frame our objects accordingly. So let's take a quick render at what we have. Okay, and you can see once the render is complete that we can now start to see a little bit of this subsurface scattering effect beginning to take shape here, although right now it is actually fairly difficult to see. So what we can start to do is start to tweak the lighting a little bit more in order to start to get a little bit more of an accentuated kind of backscattering effect here. So again, as I mentioned, the process of starting to adjust your materials and the lights can be a very simultaneous process. So let's start by taking our main light, our key light, and let's just try dropping this down a little bit, something like 0.8. Now, because I want the subsurface scattering effect to be fairly strong as far as being able to shine through the overall body of the squid, I'll take this blue light that we have as our backlighting light, and I'll pretty much start to leave its intensity at 1, or I'll start by leaving its intensity at 1. And let's take this sort of a pinkish light. This is actually responsible right now for casting quite a bit of light into the scene, so let's see if we can't kind of tone that down. Let's try something like 0.5 or 0.6 to start with. And let's see what that does for us. If that helps us out, we can save this image for comparison and re-render. Okay, so you can now start to see how that has toned down the lighting a little bit if you compare what we had before to what we have now, but it still really hasn't given us that really strong, kind of distinct subsurface scattering effect that we would really like to see. So now that we kind of have the lighting toned down, you can definitely see now how this backlight is responsible for now kind of really providing quite a bit of illumination in this back area. So now we should start to see a little bit more light kind of popping through here. So let's go back to the actual subsurface shader and let's start to make some alterations to this. So let's go to the subsurface scattering layer. A lot of times whenever working with any of these subsurface materials, I find it to be fairly useful to start by adjusting things like the diffuse weight, front weight, and back weight individually. So what I mean by that is if we were to start by taking the diffuse and the front weight both down to 0 and just leave us with the diffuse weight set to something like 1, now whenever we render we should just see the backscattering effect with no contribution from any of the others. Alright, and you can see once we render that we really still don't see any kind of a backscattering effect, which really we should be seeing something at this point. So this could indicate that there is actually a problem with the geometry. So let's explore that. Let's take a look inside the main viewport itself. A very quick and easy way to take a look at your geometry to make sure that your normals aren't flipped around is to go up to shading and then rather up to lighting, and then disable this two-sided lighting. Alright, now you can see once I did that the body of this squid has now turned black, which will only really kind of indicate that the normals have been reversed. Whenever this two-sided lighting is disabled, it will only provide illumination on the front of your geometry. If I were to go inside the geometry itself, we can actually see that it is well lit. So this becomes very, very important for things like subsurface scattering, where it does rely on having the normals pointing outward in the correct direction. Fortunately, this is pretty easy to fix. All we have to do is select the geometry, go to normals, and reverse. There we go. Excellent. Now, let's test that and start to see if we can't get something a little bit more acceptable. There we go. That's now much better. We can now start to see some of this backscattering effect begin to take place. So if whenever working with any of these subsurface shaders, if you are not actually getting the result that you think you should be, probably the first thing you'd want to check is to make sure that the normals on your geometry are pointing outward correctly. And again, disabling this two-sided lighting is a very quick and easy way to test that. Okay, so now that we have this set up, let's now start to go back to things like the backscatter radius. You can see that really right now there is a lot of light coming through from this backside, and so much so that we're actually now starting to get light that penetrates all the way through to the front of this body, which we probably don't want. So let's start by taking the radius down a little bit lower. So we'll start with 2, and we'll do the same for the depth. Ideally, these two values should be pretty close to the same value. This is controlling just how much overall scattering will happen whenever the light passes through, and the depth is really controlling just how far, how deep into the object the light will be allowed to penetrate. So with these both set to 2, let's see what we get. Okay, and you can see how that will now really kind of keep the light from penetrating some of these big, thicker areas, and really just kind of keeps the overall subsurface effect limited to some of these smaller, kind of skinnier areas of his body, which is really probably what we would want. Now, if we want to make this effect a little bit stronger, we can always start to increase the weight. So this is now what we get with a weight of 2, and you can, again, just start to see how that really just kind of makes the effect a little bit stronger. Alright, so that's the backscattering. Now, once I have this set up pretty close to how I want it, I'll just take the weight down to 0, and now we'll do the same for the front scatter. So I'll bring its weight all the way up to 1, and re-render. Again, now so we can just see the front scattering effect without any contribution from backscattering or the diffuse. So the front scattering, as you can see, is really more controlling light that comes from in front of this object, is able to partially penetrate the skin and then come back out in the same direction that it originated from. Whereas the backscattering effect was able to get us more the effect of light that's able to actually pass entirely through the surface. So in my case, the front scattering effect is actually giving us an effect that is pretty close to what I want. I really do kind of want to get the effect of this guy looking a little bit more kind of gelatinous and sort of semi-transparent. So what I will probably want to do is take some of the diffuse weight, which is the basic Lambert shading of this, and then we can also start to introduce on top of that a little bit of front scattering effect. So if I were to set these both to roughly 0.5, we can now get sort of an even mixture of both. So instead of this guy looking very, very clear and gelatinous, by just introducing now a little bit of diffuse shading combined with this front scattering, we can now start to get a result that has really some of the attributes of both. And by now starting to come back and introduce some more of that backscattering effect, we can now start to get some of this light that is able to pass entirely through some of these thinner, kind of skinnier areas of his body. Alright, so now that kind of gives us a nice framework for the overall subsurface scattering shader. So now that we have this in place, what we can start to do in our next lesson is kind of begin the process of plugging in some of the different maps that Justin has exported, and now we can start to really kind of colorize this squid and start to give him a little bit more kind of a interesting feel as far as the overall color maps go. So now we'll start to do that in our next lesson.